Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to another episode of Parla Parlor. Today I am joined by fellow Canadian, Carl Boutet, who is joining us from his hometown of Montreal. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you for having me, and good evening as well for those in that time zone.
Yes. So Carl, please just share a little bit about your background for our audience. You actually, you kind of come from very different worlds, academia, kind of the commercial side, the consulting side. So we'd love to just hear how you put all these different hats together.
And the entrepreneurial side as well. I think the hats all come together under the retail um, passion. I will make one quick correction right out of the gate. I don't necessarily consider myself academia or academic.
Okay.
I teach. I'm a lecturer. I'm a fact. I'm a faculty lecturer as well, and but I don't do any research. So for that reason, just out of respect for my real academic friends who are postdocs and who are much more uh, legitimate in their academic endeavors. I'll hold that title off, but I'm definitely a passionate, or becoming more and more a passionate provider of insights as much as possible to students and everybody that's involved in the industry, the ecosystem. My background is actually I ran for a better part of a decade the first national chain in wireless telecommunication and retail in Canada, with 65 locations, mainly partnered with Costco. That was from mid 90s to the mid 2000s, and then since then I've done a lot of consulting, advising. Did some business development work, did a lot of strategy work, and now I've sort of landed in this kind of trifecta of teaching, speaking, and doing consulting slash advisory work as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, you've had quite an interesting career, like you said, starting well, as an entrepreneur in retail and really being part of a lot of movements in the industry as it's kind of evolved and become a lot more digital, and tech has become more of a focal point of I guess, the capabilities and competitive advantage of companies.
hmm Yeah, and I mean it started quite organically in my case. I mean, I was always, I think, like a lot of people, curious about technology, and the 90s, well, obviously the internet, was really taking over, and mobile at the same time mobile was becoming um, more commoditized when I started, really in 96, and then officially full time in 98. That still wasn't 100% clear, but without knowing it, I was sort of getting into retail technology at the same time, just because I was selling it. I was selling, mobile communication. I was the first BlackBerry vendor in Canada,
Mm-hmm.
international BlackBerry vendor, and then just out of our own needs of having all these locations spread out across the country and being frustrated by the processes of having to deal with fax machines back in the day to get any kind of reporting. I saw that in the UK, O2 had launched the first pocket PC that ran on 1.5G, which was under 10 kilovolts per second. For those that are in tech speak, that means very, very slow, and had one of the first mobile POS systems, I think, developed without knowing that that's what it was, or what now it's like a whole thing. But I'm talking in the early 2000s now, where I was like, okay, we were connecting, we were connecting using handheld to do point of sale and transactions. So that was, I guess, without even me knowing it at the time, sort of my entry into the retail technology world, and then realizing, speaking about it many years after that, that was pretty innovative at the time, but I didn't consider it that. I just considered it solving a real problem that I had, and that's been kind of my mantra around how we go about thinking about retail technology even today.
So, jumping off from that, what do you think are some of the real problems that retailers are trying to solve, or that they need to solve but maybe they're not even addressing or thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different angles to this. I mean, it's sort of the whole front of house, back of house debate, and is it around the path to purchase, which I speak a lot about, and how it's increasingly digitized, and the influences are more and more digital around how we consume, and that doesn't come at the expense of physical retail. Quite to the opposite, it augments it. But it's more, thinking about thinking about that path and the complexities of it, and there's no specific recipe for it. We've been trying to do mapping, customer journey mapping for decades now, and it hasn't really given us much more clarity, except at least allows us to appreciate some of the touch points and decide where we want to make those investments in the places that make the most impact for our customers. Then there's the whole back of house side that I think is actually probably more impactful when it comes to technology, everything that helps optimize what happens behind the scenes that the customer doesn't even see. So we're talking about merchandising, pricing, optimizing the where, when, and how of how we consume. So that happens, without even the consumer being aware of it. So those I think are the sort of the main challenges, and they sort of extract in a bunch of different directions and how we decide to apply technology. But technology is not the starting point. I mean, this is something everybody's talking about for a long time. It's you got to start from either the customer or an operational need, and then sort of find your way to eventually see if there's a solution out there that addresses that need, and not the other way around.
Yeah, that's true. We hear that a lot with other retail experts, that you have to start off. The technology isn't going to be the solution. You need to understand from the customer perspective, what's the experience you're trying to create? How are you trying to delight the customer? And then how do you bring in technology to support that?
Yeah, I mean, I work off of primarily two different frameworks. So either just the classic retail equation, I'll tell, I do playing this role more and more as a bridge between the technology solution providers and the business leaders and the decision makers in the retail businesses. And I say retail, by the way, I mean that in the broadest sense possible. I put hospitality, entertainment, anything that's sort of facing a consumer for me is retail. So I bridge sort of that gap in the two frameworks. I like to provide or help them clarify what the value proposition is the classic retail equation. Is it going to help increase traffic, conversion, average basket, or margin, and then tie sort of a loyalty loop around that? So can we really measure in a tangible way the impacts on any one of those variables, and ideally maybe more than one? And then I have this retail relevance index that is pretty popular, that I know resonates with a lot of my audience, where I talk about these four attributes about how mainly on the retail side, but it can be on the technology side as well, or even the personal side, how you differentiate in the market. And the four attributes actually comes from some research that Professor Barbara Kahn did at Wharton about a decade ago when she published her Shopping Revolution book, and sort of took that and made it a bit of my own by changing some of the way we explain the variables, and especially how we measure them. But those four are pretty straightforward. It's price. Are we leading with price? Is that what's differentiating us? Which we know today is harder and harder. The supply chain competitiveness is just incredible now. If you're not truly global with your end-to-end own supply chain, you're going to have a really hard time competing on price. The next one is accessibility or convenience. She called it frictionless. I think it's just this idea of being in the most easy access, the easiest way to transact with your customers. So that can be both in store and the Retail Innovation Lab that I helped set up at McGill, where I teach. We spend a lot of time with Circle K Couche-Tard looking at different payment systems that can sort of get the customer in and out as quickly as possible. So it could be that, or it could just be the UX UI that you have in your digital assets that make it really convenient, easy, fun, maybe to a certain extent to engage. But it's more on the accessibility side. So those are sort of the pragmatic attributes around how you differentiate. Or you go to the more sort of emotional ones, which I call delight. She called experience. I call delight because I think it's this notion that you're going to create an experience, but that's more beyond just convenience can be an experience as well too. Is it something that really attracts your shoppers, specifically where they were prepared to go even out of the way, even if you're not the most price driven or the most accessible, that you're training your staff to really deliver on a high experience, or you're just creating these beautiful environments, physical or digital, that will engage your shoppers and really make them feel special. This is where things like personalization can come in as well too. Mm-hmm. And then last but not least, and one that I think is growing, an attribute that's getting more and more momentum, albeit harder and harder, as well as the whole purpose and values of the organization. Are you standing up for something that really resonates with your target market that goes beyond just economic value? Are you around social causes or environmental, or even economic? Paying your people well, those sort of things that really go out and help people say, you know what, I have the choice between A, B, and C, and I'm going to go to C just because I see that they go out of their way to do more than just sell a product at a price in a certain manner. So those are the 4 attributes. So those two frameworks, the equation and the index, are sort of my two go-tos to help people think about where it is they want to make those investments.
And the index that you just discussed, the retail relevance index, you think of it almost like a branding exercise, or is it also product specific?
It is very similar to like a perceptual map around like a branding exercise would do. So how do we differentiate in the market, how we perceive? So I think classically that would be considered a branding exercise, but I try to measure it as well too, so that we can kind of get those attributes. It's actually pretty similar to like an NPS sort of system, but the lack of it, what I find NPS lacks is sort of the reason why we're being promoted. So this gives us a little more insight around what it is that people like about us, and are we strategically aligned as an organization to make those investments to keep differentiating on those attributes, and the ones that matter most to us. We can't differentiate, very few, if any, really. And when I say differentiate, I mean like statistically significant, standard deviations, differentiation. So it has to be measurable. It can't just be us talking about ourselves around a boardroom and saying how great we are. It has to be something we go out and validate in the market.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So when you do this exercise with retailers, this I'm sure uncovers a lot of going back to the beginning of what is the actual problem that you're trying to solve, whether it's from kind of the back office operations perspective, what you were saying, the areas that customers don't see, but it actually ends up giving them contributing to that delightful experience, or the front end consumer experience, which you were calling the path to purchase.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting exercise to kind of go back to the. Maybe just give you a little more insight around that exercise. We're usually it starts and many times ends, because I think the measurement part of it always tends to intimidate the brands, is at least the alignment, and sometimes just the language it provides to help try to create that alignment. I like doing an exercise when I do workshops around this, where I'll have the leaders kind of go around and say, how do you think your brand right now differentiates in the market? What is it? What's the value proposition here as it's perceived? And I have them sort of map out on it's a 2x2 matrix. So I have them sort of plot out where they think they are in terms of those deviations and whatnot, and I make sure I said, don't share, just do this, this is how you see the organization, and then go around the table and it could be a half dozen, a dozen, 20 people around the table, and then I'll take those sheets back. I don't want them to write their name on it or anything. I just want to see it, and then I'll plot how they see the organization, and which 9 times out of 10 ends up being a spaghetti, where you just have everybody's sort of, well, if I'm in ops, I think we're really differentiating on our access, and if I'm in procurement, I think our price is great, and if I'm in marketing, I think we're really delightful, and if I'm running ESG, then I think we're so there's all these perceptions, and then you have the CEO or maybe a couple of senior vice presidents kind of looking at each other and yeah, okay, we're trying to do all things, yet at the same time we're probably not differentiating, because we're not really leaning into any of these. And then I've seen it happen a couple of times where the rest of the board agenda sort of shifts for that rest of the day after that exercise. Like, okay, let's park what we were going to talk about. We got to figure out, we have to have a serious conversation around this. And yes, you can be in operations, and we need your operational excellence. We can't lack on that, but at the same time, is that really where we're going to differentiate? Maybe it is, if we have the capabilities to do that, but it's not a given, right? So and then how we communicate that to the customer. So that part of the exercise already delivers a ton of value. And then if they want to go one step further and actually go to market and measure it, which has rarely happened, but that's sort of ultimately where I'd love this
tool to end up one day. It's something that's almost like a decade myself I've been working on, and has rarely left the boardroom, but it's still a very interesting exercise, even if it's just that.
Yeah, definitely. So taking, just kind of going back to one of the earlier comments you made about how the customer's path to purchase is now increasingly digitized, but the store, and or maybe not the store, but the physical environment is still something that's quite important. You use the word
Critical.
augment. Yeah, can you speak a little bit about that, about how you think of these two kind of, whether you call them channels or worlds or experiences, how you think about bringing them together rather than running them as two parallel journeys?
100%. 100%. I mean, that's been my mantra. I've been doing, basically keynotes for over a decade now, and that's been my go-to since day one, is this idea of started developing the entire body. You're not a physical and a digital body. You might think you're just a physical one, but you could be digitally augmented in a lot of ways, and you got to create think of the brand or the business as that one body that has the manifestations that are both physical and digital at the same time, and you need to build the muscle groupings to sustain all that more and more, because we're getting these shocks, and the pandemic was a huge wake-up call, I think, for a lot of businesses around the lack of investment and digital path to purchase. So it made their body vulnerable, i.e. the business suffered. I wrote a book called The Great Acceleration, from that experience and tracking and seeing how the path to purchase had become sort of artificially digitized, but there was lessons within that we needed to extract, so that when other events come along, we're better prepared. The subtitle of the book was The Race to Resilience, which I've now changed the race to relevance, because I think we're more in that stage right now, and it ties in with the relevance index as well too. So there's really this, that's the core, and that's probably one of the biggest challenges, I think, for many organizations, is tying those realities together, because they're both realities. They work. We know all the studies have shown that a customer, one of our, if we have a customer that shops or engages with us in different, call them channels, in different environments, the more they do so, the more engaged they become with us as well. Engagement usually translates to attention, which can also translate to revenue and margin. So those are all things that equate, and they come from an organization that recognizes, and also not just recognizes in terms of investment in the resources, but in the incentivizing for the organization. That's often where it falls apart. We want to incentivize our business leaders in each one of those touch points to maximize them, but we also need them to feel like they're part of something bigger, that they're contributing to. If I'm in charge of e-commerce, that I'm driving traffic to store, because as much as we were really concerned about the idea that people go in and to store and then buy online, it's actually the opposite. That's much more frequent. So how can we make sure that everybody benefits from understanding those realities, and vice versa? That if the person comes into store and decides to pick something up online because whatever, it's not in stock, or they just prefer the convenience of having it shipped to their house, that we're not penalizing the store for that either. Like, how do you pull those rewards together so that the entire organization benefits? Because ultimately that's what happens, and it can't just be the most senior executives that get the benefits of that. It has to trickle down into the entire organization to build that alignment.
How do you think about this balance of physical and digital when you're talking to D2C brands? Do you think that it's a maturity that eventually they have to bring in a physical element or a people element?
We've had a lot of, we've had so many reminders of that, and there's exceptions to everything, right? Let's be clear here. There's no absolutes. That's the other thing I like to talk about. Is I'm trying to give you sort of the aggregated version of where it is. There's going to be exceptions out there to all these rules, but I think in whole, we've seen that, because there's 100% need. I have a friend acquaintance of mine that started a brand called Frank and Oak. And with a business partner, and he's actually been doing a lot of interesting posts. Name's Ethan Song, if anybody wants to look him up or you want to have him on. Ethan, has a lot of reflection, because Frank and Oak is still around. He's no longer part of the ownership team, but they had some real struggles, and they were early to physical as well too. So it's not just to say and they actually rolled out a pretty aggressive store opening schedule in the U.S. But there's balance around all this that you need to respect. And unfortunately, I think the D2C challenge was not even so much the physical digital; it was venture capital was their Achilles heel, where they just had these valuations at a time when we thought the whole business model was shifting, that they couldn't live up to. And now today, still, you have the Allbirds, you have the Caspers, and even Warby Parker, which is doing a bit better, but still I don't think is yet to be profitable. But they recognized that they needed to open these physical locations to reduce their customer acquisition costs. I mean, apart from taking on too much venture capital, the other big lesson that they learned is that customer acquisition and digital channels didn't scale. I mean, they thought that their costs, of Instagram and Facebook and everything else, advertising, there was going to sort of they follow the natural laws that we used to know around, well, the more people are reached, the cheaper cost per million comes down. And they realized that wasn't the case. That actually kind of the opposite was happening, because more and more people were bidding for those same eyeballs, and their costs just exploded, and D2C didn't work. D2C on its own didn't work. So now most of them, I've tried to pivot into, I go into my Costco the other day and I see next to each other a pallet of Casper mattresses with a pallet of Harry's razors, which were sort of the classic D2C brands now in Costco. So, I mean, that shows you, and what I've always even struggled a bit with the concept, because when I'd see them on Amazon, I'd be like, is that direct to consumer? Like, aren't you going fulfilled by Amazon? So that's a channel, right? I don't think you have your own delivery trucks. I don't think you have, your own packaging facilities necessarily. Like, you're working with partners, and the idea too that the costs of running their own stores. Nike's came into this as well too, where they're like, running stores is hard. Like, it's expensive, and we have partners out there that are much better at it than we are, and seem to be able to be much more cost effective at the same time. So if we got to give them some margin that otherwise we could have kept to ourselves. But guess what? Net, we're still ahead, and where we're landing right now is I think what we've understood, and I like Simeon Siegel's take on this from BMO, who talks about a channel is not a strategy, right? So it's not. We had this whole D2C thing. We thought that was sort of a strategy. It's not. It's just a distribution channel. And now we're back at the place where we're trying to find that right equilibrium. Where yes, I want to own some of my channels, because those are some of my brand houses where I really sort of amplify. A great example right now I'm paying attention to is Levi's. They look, and Michelle was speaking last week at Shop Talk about this. I don't know if you caught that, but
I went to her keynote.
Yeah,
she was good.
So so I think she got it right. She understood, like, there's a brand experience in a Levi's store where you're going to find things you won't find anywhere else. Where we're going to do a lot more customization. We'll be able to really show you the latest and greatest, and you're going to pay a premium for that in our environment. But at least you're gonna if you're really passionate about the brand, this is probably where you're gonna want to go to get the most out of it. But if you're just looking, you like a Levi's 501 and you're just happy to get it, if you can get it for 10 or 20% less, then maybe you'll go to Macy's and pick it up there, right? So that's sort of that's more and more the play. And if you want to be on Amazon, you can be on Amazon because you're like, well, that's probably the most effective last mile. I mean, I'd have some concerns around where your IP goes around that and how much you own that path to purchase, but I can appreciate brands that decide to go down that road and why they would do it or not. But I think you have to consider all the options and not say, oh, we're a direct brand, or we're just a wholesale brand. Like, I think you want to sort of find that right equilibrium. And even if it's just one brand house, like Essence has here in Montreal, they've talked about expanding for years, but they still have that one place that really resonates and is a real strong experience, and everything else is digital, and that works too.
Yeah. Then I have to ask you about AI, because I love your thoughts around it. AI has now kind of just become an add-on, a tag that we all, not we all, but we see it, it's added on. I was at Shop Talk last week. Every single booth had something AI, something AI. And exactly. I know I love your thoughts around it, and just also, well, your thoughts around it in general, but also just a specific point that I love is that your advice to brands that they need to really understand what the AI is. It's not just AI. AI is just like saying the internet or
Electricity
electricity. Yeah, I love.
runs on electricity. Oh wow, really?
Yeah,
You mean these lights don't just turn on by themselves? Like, how
yeah.
does that? Yeah.
So I'd love you to just share kind of maybe some of your thoughts on how retailers should be thinking about AI
Yeah.
or approaching it, because
Yeah.
it's new, it's buzzy. There's so much more attention that's being given to it, as each week progresses. So just kind of how are you telling whether it's your students or you're
Yep.
speaking, or how are you approaching this subject?
Well, I approach it pretty much the same way I approach just the retail technology or the solution provider angle with those frameworks in a lot of ways, where I say, how is it going to create value? How is it going to help you differentiate? I mean, especially that's one of my biggest concerns. And let's back up a second. I mean, I wasn't even till December 2022. Yeah, I would warn my customers about the word AI because I studied it quite a bit in 2014. I did one of the first courses in we called it big data at that time. There was open enrollment, and we started seeing this movement towards, okay, how can we really get serious about leveraging our data in 2014? And so I've been paying close attention to this space, and I was telling my customers up to that point, up until December 2022, saying if a vendor shows up, a solution provider shows up saying we're AI, I would just tell them run the other way, because it means they have no clue about what they're talking about, because that AI means nothing. It's like saying we run on statistics or math. I mean, what does that mean? So what are the applications of AI? So maybe, I guess your question's kind of getting more to that, is, when I talk about the frameworks, but I say, okay, well, also let's see what's going on behind the scenes. What is it? Natural language processing? Is it computer vision? Is it machine learning of some shape, where it's basically extracting some correlations that you wouldn't have necessarily been able to, on your own to come up with, and is it going to guide you and get you up this maturity curve of how we leverage information to go from, the famous the Gardner maturity curve. We go from hindsight to insight, or we go from sort of understanding the past to predicting and actually taking action on the future, which is really topical these days with the whole rise of agentic AI. So my that would be the first thing is, and I think most retailers, quite honestly, the great acceleration did create some aftershocks, where a lot of business leaders kind of got a little crazy and went all sorts of different directions with technology without even really understanding why they were doing it. They just felt like they had to, like, they recognized they got a real hard hit, where they realized they had underinvested and they weren't ready for a more digitized path to purchase. But that didn't mean they have to go out the next day and just start placing bets on all the putting chips on every roulette square there. So they needed to be a little more thoughtful around, okay, let's go back to that relevance index. How are we going to differentiate? So is that investment in AI going to help me create more delight? Is it going to help me make my personalization more effective? Is it going to make me more accessible? Is it going to help better predict what customers want and make sure that I have the right stock? Or is it going to help me with my pricing, because it's going to make my buying more effective, and I can, I can maybe translate that into pass along some margin dollars to my client. So there's all these different but it really comes back to the basics. And I think the more senior leaders understood that, and yes, they got caught up for a while. The danger is also on the other side of that, is where they kind of got a little too shocked, and they got, their investors came back and said, or the stake said, listen, you got to really reel it in, i.e. like Nike, where they said, okay, you went really hard in the metaverse. You did a lot of, big digital bets that have more or less played off, because they're really longer term. I mean, a lot of these things are not going to pay off overnight. With a CEO at the time that came from a very digital background. But lost touch of some of the fundamentals along the way that they needed to refocus on. But it doesn't mean, actually my second book is called Blind Spot, and Blind Spot was around this notion that we got to be careful to keep our at least our attention open. It doesn't mean we have to make all the investments. Let's just be aware, and a lot of those are tied to AI and how the different manifestations. And the reason why I said December of 2022, where I changed a bit my perception on the use of the word AI is I think we mean generative AI in most cases now, and that was obviously that that week when I was teaching in Vietnam was the launch of ChatGPT, and that was a blind spot even for me that was following, I thought, these large language models that I thought I understood, and even with the attention I was giving it that was probably a lot higher than most, it caught me off guard. So and that's I know usually what business leaders are the most concerned about when we the classic "what keeps you up at night" question. It's often like, how do I know what I don't know? How do I see what's coming around the corner? And Blind Spot sort of just talks about this idea you got to kind of keep your head up, keep your eyes open. Yes, some bets didn't pay off 2 or 3 years ago when you were going in all these directions. It doesn't mean that they're completely obsolete. A good example of that is back to the metaverse. Everybody kind of rolls their eyes and like, the gaming industry is still doing really well, and I'm seeing again. I just saw some, McDonald's making some big investments in that space. It depends who you're, again, how you're going to differentiate and who your target market is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true. Carl, this was fantastic. I feel like we can do a whole session on your index, the Retail Relevance Index, and go through almost like a working session with a real application and deep dive into a company.
Yep.
And then we can also do one on AI. We've had a really good chat on that, which I'd love to also dive into at another time. Always so many things we can chat about.
Hey, I teach at McGill, so you're welcome to register anytime. We even do executive education, so you're happy to welcome. But no, we can obviously continue the conversation, and it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Well, you might see me one day with my hand up in the class, so.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Likewise.